You're watching World Insight with me, James Chow. This is a half-hour program, and as most of you know by now, we use these 30 minutes to bring you an in-depth look at the week's top stories. Now, here's our first in-depth report. On Monday, leaders of the G8 countries, that's Britain, Canada, Italy, Japan, France, Germany, Russia and the United States, all gathered in Tokyo up in northern Japan. At this year's summit, the 8 heads were charged with kick-starting the stumbling world economy, also pushing forward faltering talks on climate change and making good on pledges to battle poverty and hunger. Here's that story.
No matter how small the effect these trees will have on decreasing the world's temperature, this symbolic gesture demonstrates the commitment the G8 leaders have to the environment. On Tuesday, the G8 summit endorsed halving world emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050.
After today's G8 summit, we agreed to set the goal for reducing all global emissions of gases by at least 50% by 2050 as a target to be taken up by the entire world.
But the final agreement on climate change stopped short of tough mid-term targets.
In 2050, Mr. Fukuda will be 114 years old, and it's difficult to think that his promises about 2050 are meaningful unless he tells us what he's going to do right now.
Look at this camera up here.
Besides the challenge of climate change, the G8 countries also face mounting pressure to resolve the globe's most pressing economic problems.
Food stocks are at the lowest for 30 years. We're facing food riots in many countries as a result of the high price of food. We're facing rising costs for families in every country of buying basic items, bread, milk, eggs.
Sudden rises in oil prices are hitting not only the world's economy, but also ordinary people's lives.
Soaring oil prices, food shortages, market losses, and a weakening U.S. dollar. The woes of the global economy have not only stifled growth in developed nations, but are also curbing progress in emerging and developing economies. And many of these problems originated from developed nations or are closely related to them.
The U.S. subprime mortgage crisis sent shockwaves through financial markets around the world. Tax barriers and farm subsidies in the United States and the European Union weakened the competitiveness of farmed goods from developing countries, reducing supply on the world market.
The G8 originated in the wake of the energy crisis and the ensuing economic crunch of the 1970s. It was set up to discuss the global economic situation and coordinate policies to reinvigorate world economies. But today, except for an expression of strong concern about the elevated commodity prices, especially oil and food, the group seems unable to do much about the current economic disturbance.
On the one hand, the G8 is politically important because it can set new international agendas and stimulate discussions. On the other, the G8 has its limits. The summit is, generally speaking, a mere forum of the world's richest countries. It doesn't have any legislation power. The statements they announce are not legally binding and will not necessarily be fulfilled.
At the 2005 summit in Gleneagles, Scotland, the G8 leaders pledged $25 billion in new aid to Africa by 2010. But there is a yawning chasm between rhetoric and reality. Aid groups criticized the G8 because only $3 billion of the money has been delivered so far. Although 7 African leaders were invited to attend this year's gathering, they want more in the way of tangible help rather than verbal promises. World Bank President Robert Zoellick urged the leading industrialized countries to come good on their promises.
And it's a test we cannot afford to fail. This G8 summit must bring hope to those without hope, food to those without food.
African development, discussed this year, was the subject of the Gleneagles meeting in 2005. Oil security has again been of concern, despite being addressed at the St. Petersburg summit in 2006. And some think that the country's commitment to cut emissions by 50% by 2050 is empty, as they pledged to seriously consider emission reduction at last year's Heiligendamm summit. As global problems proliferate, the G8 summit's response looks even shabbier and more feeble.
Nowadays, the G8 can hardly handle the global issues of significant leverage effectively. Although their combined gross economy accounts for 2/3 of the world's total, their populations only constitute 10% of the world as a whole. They cannot afford to neglect concerns from the other countries, especially those of emerging economies, which also contribute a lot to world economic growth.
After decades of dividing the world into the rich and powerful West and the developing rest, leaders from 5 outreach countries, Brazil, China, India, Mexico, and South Africa, have been invited to join the G8 in recent years. The first handshake between developing countries and the G8 was at the 2003 Evian summit. Since then, the G8 has invited the 5 major developing powers to its summits for dialogue almost every year.
The summits between northern and southern countries and the collaboration between our people and the rich countries make the mechanism of the G5 invaluable. We are hoping to find solutions to our problems in such a way that we will be able to provide international reform that will improve the capability of our countries to confront developing risks.
According to UN statistics, Brazil, Russia, India, and China accounted for more than 50% of growth in terms of the purchasing power of currencies over the past 5 years.
It is feasible, even compulsory, for developed and developing countries to have dialogue and cooperate in economic fields as their economies become more interdependent. But such dialogue should be held on an equal footing and marked by mutual trust. It should not become an excuse for the major industrialized nations to shirk their responsibilities.
The relationship between those who emerged the strongest out of the 20th century and some of the potential shapers of the 21st century leaves open the question of how the old world order should be adapting to the new.
Now let's stay on this story with a bit more of an in-depth look. The powers, many say, don't just write history, they also grab the seats at the top tables of the world's leading bodies. They decide who can join their cozy clubs, and some say expect the rest of the world to obey their instructions as they hand them down. But in a stark reflection of global power shifts, the G8, once a conglomerate of the most powerful nations, has increasingly had to look to others as they try and resolve the world's problems. Now, for the emerging developing countries, growing economic clout means greater responsibilities. But in the meantime, in order to ensure consistent growth, they should keep their rights and their duties balanced when taking part in these global institutions. This is World Insight, time for our very first break, but after that we're going to take you to Mongolia for a look at the country's political crisis. Don't go away, keep watching us here.